Welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very pleased to bring Kai Bird. Kai is a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian who has published biographies about John McCloy, Robert Oppenheimer, and his most recent, The Outlier, the Unfinished Presidency of Jimmy Carter. He is the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. In this episode, we talk about Jimmy Carter and his fabulous biography that he wrote on Jimmy Carter. We start the conversation by talking about the context and environment in which Carter was born in the 1920s of rural Georgia. We talk about how Carter dealt with racism growing up. We talk about the importance of his Christian faith, the bond with his wife. We talk about why people view Carter's presidency as weak and ineffective. We, kind of discuss whether Carter was, really responsible for inflation and unemployment in the mid to late 70s. Why he gave back the Panama Canal to Panama, the Camp David Accords, the Iran hostage situation, why he didn't get reelected in 1980, and what the enduring legacy is of Jimmy Carter. I have to say I was really, really honored to have Kai come on. He's obviously pretty respectable in the field of history and biographies, and his book on Jimmy Carter is magnificent. I mean, it's hard to find another book on Jimmy Carter that is so good. So I was very, very happy to talk with Kai. We had an awesome conversation, and I'm very pleased to bring you that conversation with Kai Bird. I'm here with Kai Bird. Kai, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm greatly looking forward to talking with you.
Well, great for having me. Thank you.
Yeah. So before we get into your wonderful new book, tell listeners who you are and what you do and all the particulars.
Well, I write biographies. I've been writing biographies for 30 years. I think I started in 1981 or so, working on my first biography. And I've done 7 books in all. And but currently I actually have a real job. I'm the executive director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography at City University's Graduate Center in New York City.
Very nice. That's
where I get to give money away to working biographers, fellowships, and I also have the opportunity to invite people, new biographers, to talk about their new books on stage and give them a platform to talk about their books.
Oh, that's great. It sounds like you're giving back to
I am
to folks.
And I've been very fortunate along the way. I've spent years writing biographies, but I won the Pulitzer Prize in 2006 for a co-authored biography of J. Robert Oppenheimer that I did with Martin J. Sherwin. And that book is now being turned into a movie.
Oh, that's exciting. Is this the one with Christopher Nolan?
Yes.
Oh, that's exciting. So they're using your book for source material, the whole thing, yeah?
Yeah, it's heavily based on the book, and a lot of the dialogue comes out of the book.
Oh, wow. That's, how does that feel?
Well, sort of weird.
I can imagine, right? It's flattering, but then also strange, no?
It's Christopher Nolan's film, but so it's a creative process, as you know. Film is very different from a book, but
sure.
I have hopes that it's going to be a very good film.
Yeah, no, that's exciting. That's super exciting. Well, you have a great career, and you've obviously, as you mentioned, you've won the Pulitzer, which is amazing. But you wrote a new book called The Outlier, the Unfinished Presidency of Jimmy Carter. You don't have to go too much into it, but why did you decide to tackle Jimmy Carter's life in your next or most recent biography?
Well, literally 30 years ago, in 1990, I was sort of looking for a new project after finishing my first biography. And I was curious and mystified by Jimmy Carter and mystified by why he was a one-term president, mystified by his politics. And he was then just starting out with the Carter Center. And so I went down to Georgia and did a magazine piece, interviewed him on the phone and interviewed a bunch of his people at the Carter Center about what he was doing with his ex-presidency. And I did this sort of as a way to explore whether I was the right guy to do a presidential biography of Jimmy Carter. And I wrote the magazine piece. It was a nice cover story talking about all the good things that Carter was doing with his ex-presidency. But I came away from the experience convinced that I was the wrong guy to do Jimmy Carter. And the reason was that I sort of realized that Carter was a man of the South. I didn't understand the South. I didn't understand his Southern baptism, his religion. I didn't understand race. It was a foreign country. And I thought I'd have to move to South Georgia and be like a foreign correspondent if I was going to attempt that book. But so I backed off. But I was always curious about Carter and, came back to it eventually. And by that time, his presidential papers had really opened up by 2015 when I started the book. And I got access to him. I could interview him on 4 or 5 occasions. And, I still had doubts about whether I, as a Yankee, could understand the Deep South, but I was more confident that I could tackle the subject.
Well, I mean, you do a masterful job. It's an incredible book. And it's strange. I remember picking up and reading it and saying, it's quite rare that, someone's still alive when a biography is being written on them. And usually I think the kind of, casual time period is, 40 years or 40 plus years before you write about presidents to see how long their policies become in place and how you see how they evolve. And, Carter's still around. He's still alive and
he's 97 and he's still kicking.
Yeah, still pretty lucid. And, that's after all the stuff he's been through. So it's pretty remarkable. So, well, let's spend a little bit on his kind of early life, but then much as the book does, spend some time on his on the presidency. So I've heard it in many places, and I think you kind of mentioned in the book is that he kind of has lived in 3 centuries because Plains, Georgia, in the mid-20s wasn't really that different from the 1870s or 1880s or et cetera, as there's no electricity, no insulation. So and then obviously he lived throughout the entire 20th century. We're now into the second decade of the 21st century. So he's lived a very full life, right, with a front row seat to many things that have happened in the 20th century. What can we say, I guess, about his, how he was born into an area of the country that was still, for the most part, not that different from kind of post-Civil War, which is crazy to say it that way. Yep. How did that kind of shape his life and his upbringing?
Well, this is the sort of enduring mystery about Jimmy Carter. He came from Archery, South Georgia, just 2 miles down the road from Plains, population 657 or whatever. Mm-hmm. And it really was when he was growing up as a kid in the 1920s and 30s, he might easily have been growing up in the 1870s or 80s. His father was a farmer and owned eventually several 2,000 or 3,000 acres of land, but it was tilled by sharecroppers, and they often used mules with wooden plows, and there was no electricity, no running water. There was an outhouse in the back of the house. I mean, it was 19th century.
Yeah.
And it was very rural, very isolated. And his father was a white supremacist who believed in segregation. Mm-hmm. So, it's astonishing that Jimmy Carter came from that red-baked clay earth in South Georgia and emerged as sort of a liberal populist president.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about in the book about how, obviously there's the contextual stuff, but you mentioned how he was close with his dad, at least when he was growing up, but his dad had some, again, white supremacist views. Obviously, race was all the negative aspects of race relations was there in Georgia. This didn't stick with him, and I'm sure it did with a lot of folks. I mean, is it really, like you're saying, just a mystery, maybe something with temperament and personality? What was it that kind of shielded him from digesting all of that?
Well, I call the book The Outlier precisely because he was an outlier in South Georgia, in Plains. His neighbors were all typical Southerners with all the prejudices that might stereotypically imply, but he was not. And I argue in the book, the only reason he's sort of different is because of Miss Lillian, his mom, who we know as Miss Lillian, who we know from her stints on the Johnny Carson show, late night TV in the 70s. Where she was a very frank-talking, eccentric Southern lady who was obviously a liberal. And she stood out even in South Georgia when Jimmy was a boy. She would like to provoke her neighbors by praising the good qualities of Abraham Lincoln. Well, you didn't do that in the South. Abraham Lincoln was not a popular figure. Right. So she just was very unusual and had her own eccentric views, and she passed them on. And even though Jimmy, growing up, most of his playmates were African Americans, he was literally the only white boy in archery. Nevertheless, he grew up realizing from his mom, Miss Lillian, that his playmates were human beings just like him. And he just didn't have a racist bone in his body. And however, it's interesting, later on when he goes off to the Navy and he has a career for 7-8 years in the Navy, and then he quits a promising Navy career and comes back to South Georgia. This is in the early 50s. He does this because his father had suddenly died of pancreatic cancer. And he feels compelled to come back to take care of the family farm and business, but also because he had some doubts about whether he wanted to spend the rest of his life in the Navy managing weapons of mass destruction. Anyway, he comes back in the 50s at the very beginning of the civil rights movement, and he keeps his head down. He doesn't get involved in the civil rights movement, even though everyone in town knows that he has liberal views on race. So he's very complicated and interesting and clever. And again, I think he's an outlier. It's Miss Lillian, but it's also his just innate intelligence. He read a lot as a boy. Growing up, Miss Lillian, at the dinner table, there was no conversation. Everyone brought a book to the dinner table. So they were readers. Again, that was very unusual in the South in those years.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Yeah, obviously he goes away to the Navy and stuff, and so he comes back. And I guess there's two main points I want to bring into the picture here. Is one is his, I think a lot of politicians will say something about their religious faith. Some of it might be just, that's the thing you have to say. You got to, just put on the good face. But I mean, Jimmy Carter is through and through, devout Christian. I mean, he always has been, still is. Even while he was president, he was a really true believer. So how much was that an impact on how it shaped all of his ideas, and then the influence and incredibly strong bond that he has with Rosalynn? Maybe just talk about those two big things.
Yes, yeah. He was a born again Christian. Born again meaning he had a commitment to Jesus Christ in a personal way after he, in 1966, after he first lost his first race for governor, the governorship, and that defeat plunged him into depression, and he had a sort of emotional reckoning. It was a very intellectual born-again experience. I mean, there were no flashing lights or mysticism. He, went back to studying the Bible, and theologians like Reinhold Niebuhr, not a Southern Baptist congregationalist, but he really admired the writings of Reinhold Niebuhr, and he found a way through his religious commitment, which had always been there growing up as a boy in the South. He had a dilemma throughout his life, which was how to reconcile his enormous intelligence with his faith and his enormous ambition, knowing that he was a smart guy, with his faith, knowing that as a Southern Baptist, the worst sin you can commit is that of pride, the sin of pride. Well, he had a lot of pride. And so the way he sort of reconciled this inner conflict was by embracing the writings of Reinhold Niebuhr, who argued that if you're a man of faith, if you're religiously committed, you have to understand that the world is a sinful place, and that you have to, if you have the chance to exercise power, you have to make it a better place. And so he justified his political ambitions with the argument, the rationalization, the argument that he could make the world a better place if he became governor, if he became president. And this goes a long way to explain his motivations and his behavior in the White House, actually. But then I also need to come back to your question about Rosie, as he calls Rosalynn. She also grew up in Plains. They knew each other's ever since she was a baby. She's 2 years younger. And he married her when she was 19. And she, had graduated high school and had a little bit of community college, but no other university education. But she turned out to be an amazing politician herself. And she had good political instincts, and she was very smart and a good partner. And she took over eventually she was the accountant for the peanut warehouse family business. And when he decided to go into state politics, she went out on the campaign road, but could feel physically nauseous when she had to give a speech initially. It was such a new experience. But she trained herself to give that speech. And she actually became quite articulate. And during the presidential years, Rosalynn was the one who actually was better on TV, on things like Meet the Press, than Jimmy, who was always a little wooden on television. But anyway, it turned out to be an amazing partnership. And she was in many ways, his closest political advisor.
Yeah, you get the sense throughout, the book and just kind of from what we know throughout history that she's kind of his rock. They have such a incredible bond, and still going. So it's just quite spectacular. I want to jump to the presidency. So obviously, for listeners, once he comes back from the Navy, he eventually gets into politics, even though you mentioned he wasn't political. So he state senator, then he was governor of Georgia, and then he runs for president and wins in 1976. And I guess the one question I just want to kind of tee us up for this conversation is, most people to this day, so I was asking a few people before we had this conversation, what do you know about Jimmy Carter? And it's like, oh, there's always this negative way in which people speak about his presidency. Now, most people will grant him post-presidency. He was one of the, most wonderful people, all the work that he's done for 40 years or plus, whatever it is, he's no one takes that away from him.
But they all say he was the failed president.
Right. Yeah. They say, oh, well, what about, gas prices and inflation and unemployment and all of these horrible things. And that's almost seen as a type of insult. Like, you'll be a one-termer like Carter was. People said that with President Obama before he was running for re-election. People have said it now currently with President Biden. So I guess just generally, before we get into the details, why is that? Like, why do people have such this negative impression of his presidency there?
Well, there are a couple sort of obvious reasons. One is, of course, that he lost his bid for re-election to Ronald Reagan. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons he lost was that he was perceived as sort of being preachy and self-righteous and critical of America. He gave that famous speech that is called the Malaise speech, where he talked about, he sort of had it was almost a sermon about how the American people should realize that they can't really achieve happiness solely through material goods. And, he was talking about the spiritual needs of the country and the need for community, and that we can't just think of the individual. And along comes Ronald Reagan talking about the sunny side of America and how everything is possible and we're an exceptional nation. Mm-hmm. Well, Jimmy Carter understood, particularly as a man of the South, that America was not exceptional, that there were problems in American history, race being among them. Yeah. And so he was regarded as kind of a dour president in that way. But the other reason is that he just was a victim of historical circumstances. There was the energy crisis of 1971 and then 73 from the Arab oil embargo of 73, and that led to a spiraling inflation, price rises, all driven by largely the price of natural resources, fuel. And then there was the Iran hostage crisis, where he was perceived as a victim, weak, unable to get the hostages released. Yeah. Then he also did a lot of things that were tough decisions that were politically costly to his own base. So he tackled the Panama Canal Treaty, which was very unpopular, and Reagan ran, saying, that's our canal. And Jimmy Carter gave it up. He tackled the Camp David Accords and, got an Arab-Israeli peace treaty. And yet, because he was also had also thought that he had achieved a deal with regard to Palestinian autonomy and a freeze on the building of Jewish settlements, Israeli settlements in the West Bank. And because he was willing to sort of try to twist the Israelis' arms about settlements, he lost the vote of Jewish American voters in 1980. He deregulated the airline industry, which allowed middle-class Americans to fly for the first time. But one of the unintended consequences of that was that it weakened the labor unions in the airline industry. So big labor was unhappy with him. And then there was Ted Kennedy. who ran against a sitting president trying to take away the nomination from the Democratic Party from Carter. And that political battle greatly weakened Carter going into the general election. So, there are a lot of good reasons why he was perceived as weak and ineffectual and a victim. But a lot of these were circumstances that were not of his creation and out of his hands.
Yeah, I think that most people, or many people, will that will be kind of the defense for Carter. And I don't have strong opinions about him one way or the other in terms of where he sits historically, but I do feel some kind of way where people are just so quick to kind of minimize his accomplishments or always just talk negatively about him. I mean, you talk about in the first, I see kind of him as kind of a tale of two parts. There's the first 2 years and then the second 2 years, right? And the first 2 years are a little bit better, which I think is usually true for most presidents. They come in there, they have a little bit of some political capital, whatever.
Right.
But he had some accomplishments. I mean, he said early in his administration he wanted to emphasize human rights, SALT II, canceling the B-1 program. He believed giving the Panama Canal was right, or giving it back. I'll come to that in a minute. But yeah, you mentioned the Airline Deregulation Act. There was obviously the National Gas Act. There was what he did with craft breweries, and the welfare reform bill didn't pass. But I mean, in the first year and a half, he had some accomplishments. Is it just everything else gets overshadowed with that, or why do people forget that he did have some impact, especially on I think it was also clean water, and he had a lot of impact on energy. Why do people not give him his due, I guess?
Yeah, well, we have short memories, and
yes.
And the Iran hostage crisis, I think, overshadowed a lot. If things had gone a different way on the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis, he might have been reelected. Yeah, people are just simply forgetting. He saved Social Security by reforming it. He passed more legislation, I argue, in his 4 years than Obama did in 8 years. And, he did control the House. The Democratic Party controlled the House and the Senate and the White House. And as a result, not surprisingly, they actually did pass a lot of legislation, consequential stuff. And, for instance, he appointed all sorts of Ralph Naderite acolytes to the government, to regulatory agencies. So, for instance, it was under Jimmy Carter that we got mandatory seat belts and mandatory airbags built into all our cars. That alone saved 10,000 lives, American lives every year.
Yeah.
It's an extraordinary accomplishment. You mentioned his cancellation of the B-1 bomber, which was a big boondoggle, very expensive. And Carter understood that stealth bombing technology was coming around the corner and that the B-1 would simply be a waste of money. So he canceled it. And then, he loses in 1980 and Ronald Reagan and the Republicans come into power and they revive it. And of course, they built it, a few of these very expensive bombers that have never really been used for anything. He did a lot environmentally. His actions unilaterally, executive decisions in Alaska, tripled the size of the wilderness area in Alaska and preserved all that beautiful landscape for generations to come. It's a long list. It's an amazing list, but people tend to sort of focus on the black clouds of the hostage crisis, inflation, and also, he was a man of the South. And the first president elected from the Deep South. And a lot of people just didn't understand him culturally. didn't like his accent. I mean, there was really a lot of prejudice against his demeanor, the way he talked, his religiosity. And again, they didn't like his criticisms of American exceptionalism. And they didn't like his preaching about, he at one point early on in his administration, he gave this really amazing speech about foreign policy in which he said that the time for our inordinate fear of communism is over. We're no longer going to use our inordinate fear of communism to justify supporting any right-wing general in small countries all over the third world. And, as you mentioned, he made instead human rights, at least rhetorically, as a sort of centerpiece of U.S. foreign policy. And no American president has been able to walk away from the notion that human rights should be a founding principle of our foreign policy. So again, I think as time goes by, the perception that Americans have of Jimmy Carter is no doubt going to change. He's going to be seen as almost a prophet, prescient in his views on the environment, on our relations with the rest of the world, particularly the third world, the developing world. And, he's also his scandal-free administration is not to be forgotten. We've had too many scandals in the decades since Jimmy Carter left. And Carter emerged in his 4 years without, nothing personally touched him. He had to fire Burt Lance because Lance had gotten involved in some, it was discovered that he had some sort of shady small town banking practices in Georgia. But that wasn't something that touched personally Jimmy Carter.
Yeah. One other thing I forgot to mention was that he also nominated many, I think, women and I think African Americans to certain positions of power within government, which was huge at the time. And so, there's so many things that he's done. I mean, it's why it's so interesting when people talk so negatively about his presidency.
Yeah, he was the president who nominated in the first instance, Ruth Bader Ginsburg to the appellate court, which gave her the stepping stone to the Supreme Court under Bill Clinton.
Right.
He nominated more women and more African Americans to the federal bench than all his predecessors combined before him.
Yeah, I mean that's
it's
huge.
Just he remade the judiciary to make it sort of look more like the rest of the country.
Yeah. I mean, and again, mid 70s is still not that far from Jim Crow South and all the things that we went through with civil rights. I just one last thing, I guess, on domestic stuff before we kind of just turn to foreign affairs, is how much. So unemployment and inflation is like the big thing he gets hit with. At the time, and I'm asking this because it is somewhat relevant nowadays. People are talking about the same, inflation's high at the moment as well.
Right.
How much does, I guess, any president, but how much does Carter get dinged for that? Like, is it obviously it's maybe not his fault that it happened, but how he didn't fix it or how he continued to let it, people are, lining up to get gas and all of that. I mean, there's that problem as well. I mean, what was it about, these issues in the economy that he couldn't fix it, or was that his fault, or was it just a bunch of things? How do we understand that accurately?
Yeah, well, the criticism that's leveled at President Biden today is often laced with a comparison to Carter.
Right.
And, inflation is Biden's discovering. It's very hard to control. And he hasn't really done anything to. He's not responsible for it. Inflation is happening now because of the pandemic and because of supply chain, because of China, because of shortages. And likewise, during the Carter administration in the 70s, inflation began to go up steadily because of the oil price increases due to the Arab oil embargo, but also due to heavy deficit spending during the Vietnam War era, where Congress wasn't actually appropriating money. So Carter comes in, and here I criticize him a little bit for his lack of understanding of sort of basic macroeconomics. Was he comes in with a sort of small town, South Georgia, fiscal conservative attitude about the federal budget. And he looked at the federal budget in 1977, and there was a $25 billion federal deficit, which sounded to him like a lot, but we laugh at it today.
Right. Yeah.
And he had the notion that, as a small town businessman, that you should balance your budget. And the federal government should balance its budget. But we've learned actually there is no relationship between, or doesn't have to be a relationship between the federal budget and deficits and inflation. Inflation can be going down at the same time that the federal deficit is growing. Inflationary factors are driven by other things. Anyway, he was so concerned about this that he began to, watch the federal budget very carefully and began to refuse to appropriate money for Democratic Party liberal constituency programs. So, he was undermining his own political constituency by doing this, killing pork barrel projects, water projects in every congressional district around the country. That just proved to be very unpopular, and it really didn't help to solve the inflation problem. So finally, out of frustration, 3 years into his presidency, he thought he's sort of tried everything, and he decides he's really got to get a handle on inflation. And so against the political advice of all his political advisors, he appoints Paul Volcker to be head of the Fed, knowing that Volcker is a Democrat, but a Democrat who believes, from his study of the Depression and inflation and other historical periods, that the way to kill this inflationary spiral is to jack up interest rates to 13, 14, 15% and limit the money supply, print less money. And so he did this knowing that it was going to put a brake on the economy, just at the moment where Carter was launching his campaign for re-election. But Carter decided this was the right thing to do. And, it was just another example of a political decision that he made that he knew was going to have high political costs, but he did it anyway because he thought it was the right thing to do. And it did succeed. Volcker did finally succeed. It was very harsh medicine, but he killed inflation, but not until 1982, 2 years after Carter had lost the election.
Yeah, I think that's some of the problems sometimes with presidencies is that, you can't, because of all the political stuff, re-election or there's a midterm or something, it kind of hamstrings, politicians from doing the thing they probably should because they don't want to lose political points. But, that's always a kind of a tough, I think, tightrope to walk. Really quick, since we brought it up, what was the big incentive to give back the Panama Canal to Panama? I mean, he was heavily criticized for that. I mean, was it just this we didn't deal with this well with with how Teddy did this, and I think you mentioned in the book that he had read McCullough's book on
David
the Panama
McCullough's
Canal.
book on the
Yeah,
Panama,
which
building of the Panama Canal. Right.
yeah, was it that just he didn't like how we handled it and wanted to kind of right a wrong, or was it more than that?
Well, no, there were brewing political issues in Panama, and it was nationalist forces in Panama were on the rise, and the president of Panama at the time, General Trujillo, was promising his people that he was going to get control of the canal, and if he failed, Carter was given intelligence that showed that if they didn't address this brewing issue, that very soon down the road, maybe within a few years, America would face guerrilla insurgency, armed uprising.
Yeah.
And there are American citizens down there living in the canal zone. It was a real dicey security issue. And so Carter believed that it would be wise and prudent to address this with diplomacy. And the more he studied the issue, and this is how he came to any political decision, he always studied things. He hated to be in big, long verbal meetings with lots of people. He wanted to read memos and books. And so he read David McCullough's book, and lo and behold, he realized that we actually had stolen that canal. and that, historically speaking, the right thing to do would be to find a compromise to give the sovereignty over the canal itself back to the Panamanians, but have a second treaty that addresses security issues and the running of the canal. Rosalynn Carter told him, Jimmy, why can't you just put this difficult issue off to your second term? And he argued, no, it's the right thing to do now. If we put it off too long, bad things could happen. And he knew it was going to be politically costly and a tough fight, and it was. It passed very narrowly. Yeah. And 7 of the Democratic senators who voted for it, and a few Republicans, 7 Democratic and Republican senators, but mostly Democrats who voted for it, were defeated in the next round. So that was very politically costly. But he thought it was the right thing to do.
Yeah. Tell us real quick, you do a really nice job in the book, kind of covering the 2 weeks at Camp David. Just kind of give us the brief overview of, how he got everyone at the table, if you will, how the kind of a little bit of the back and forth, where it ended, and then how he had some kind of tough feelings about what happened afterwards with the West Bank settlements and things like that. Just kind of give us the overview.
Exactly. Well, again, he came into office, he'd had no foreign policy experience to speak of, a few trips abroad, one to Israel for a week where he tooled around in a Volvo. And, but he had a belief that this was an issue that needed to be solved, peace between Arabs and Israelis. And he just dove into it against the advice of his foreign policy advisors, including the Secretary of State, Cy Vance, and his national security advisors, Zbigniew Brzezinski. And he was just relentless in trying to get the Israelis and Egyptians to talk. And finally, he invited them to Camp David for this famous 13 days, where Anwar Sadat of Egypt and Menachem Begin of Israel came and were literally sort of forced by Carter into isolation in cabins up there in the mountains outside of Washington, and spent 13 days where Carter just shuttled back and forth between the cabins. Sadat and Menachem Begin they could hardly talk to each other personally. So Carter was the intermediary, and it would not have happened without Carter. It was his personal diplomacy, making them, ironing out an agreement word by word on yellow legal pad. And he was just relentless. And he did get everyone to make a lot of compromises. And he did get what is still 40 plus years later a cold peace between Egypt and Israel. And he got the Israelis to agree to give back the Sinai to Egypt. And he sincerely, genuinely believed that he got Menachem Begin to agree to a 5-year settlement on the building of settlements, Israeli settlements in the West Bank. And during a 5-year period of negotiations on creating Palestinian autonomy. And Begin, he believed, agreed to this, and then within days began to renounce it publicly. And Carter felt he'd been lied to or manipulated, or but he thought he believed that Begin knew better, and that he had just simply backed out of a deal that was in the interest of Israel. And so he continued even after Camp David, even after the peace treaty was signed. Throughout the rest of his presidency, he began, he urged the Israelis to stop building settlements because this was going to make a 2-state solution, or any solution, just impossible. And indeed, even after he left the White House, Carter was not shy about talking about the Israeli settlements in the West Bank, which has made him very unpopular among the Jewish American community this day.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, props to him for trying. I mean, it's a complicated challenge, and I think he did as best he probably could at it. I mean, it's not many people have really tried to tackle it since. Real quick, another big thing here, I guess on foreign policy, is on Iran. So it seems that you say in the book that he seemed to get the seriousness of what was going on there. Like, he wasn't kind of blindsided per se about what was kind of brewing of sorts. But I guess what happened? I mean, how did he not be able to get the hostages back all the way up to what was kind of going on?
Well, there was nothing that Jimmy Carter or any other American president could have done to stop the Iranian Revolution, I argue. This was something that was organic. It was happening due to internal reasons. The Shah's regime, the Pahlavi regime, had very little legitimacy to begin with, and it was becoming more and more unpopular. So when the protests in the streets became violent and people were killed by army soldiers shooting at people, it just escalated and it got out of control, and the revolution became inevitable. But Carter was being advised by Zbig Brzezinski, his national security advisor, to take a hard line, that the Shah was our dear ally, longstanding ally, and that we should urge him to launch a military coup and just have a violent crackdown on the unarmed, nonviolent protesters in the streets. And Carter, thought this was, he was skeptical about this. He had moral qualms about a military coup, but he allowed Brzezinski to explore the option and became convinced that it just was not practical. The Shah wasn't capable of doing it. The Iranian military was crumbling internally, and there was no constituency there to do it. So the revolution happens. Ayatollah Khomeini comes in, and you recall that was in February of 79, and then 10 months later in November the American embassy is taken over for the second time.
Yeah.
And this time, unlike the first occasion, which just lasted for a day or two, this lasted for 444 days. And Carter, again, tried to study the issue and tried to figure out what's the right thing to do. And his Secretary of State, Cy Vance, told him diplomacy will take care of this. The hostages will be released when Khomeini no longer has any political reason to hold them. And he then spent the next almost year trying to figure out back channels diplomatically to communicate some kind of deal. And in great frustration, he finally relented in the face of Zbigniew Brzezinski's lobbying and agreed to try a military helicopter rescue mission, which was extremely improbable. It was probably doomed to fail. And indeed, it did fail, and it was humiliating and another sort of another defeat in terms of public relations for the Carter presidency. So it was just a terribly frustrating ordeal. And Carter he didn't want to do what Brzezinski was urging him to do, which was to use some kind of military force, if not to rescue the hostages, to mine the harbors or airstrikes. And Carter rejected all of these because he believed that this would endanger the hostages, and he thought that in the end, diplomacy would get them all out. And he was right. But again, it was at great political cost.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a whole interesting part about it in the book where you talk about the October surprise.
Right.
Certain operatives for the Reagan administration doing some not so good things. And, it goes without saying that this is probably the thing because of how messy it was that probably cost him the getting reelected. But is there anything else we can say about, why he didn't get reelected? I mean, obviously there was, Reagan, and he was, very charismatic, and, obviously there was still the issues we've talked about up to this point that were still ongoing, but were people just kind of not really connected with Carter? Like you had said, he was kind of very wooden and very, there was that major speech where it seemed like he was blaming Americans for their consumerism. And it was just like, I like the actor. Reagan's a little bit more, he's going to be a little bit cheery. This is not going to be such a, so cynical. I mean, was it that, or, what could we say about that election in 80 about why he lost?
Yeah. People didn't like Jimmy Carter preaching to them about blaming America. And yet, Carter, I've mentioned several times, he just was willing to take on enormous political risk and pay the political consequences for what he thought was the right thing to do.
Yeah.
So this really, if you look at the voter turnout and how people voted, in 1976, Jimmy Carter won the evangelical vote. He won the African American vote, by 70, 80%. Evangelicals, too, by 70, 80%. He won union households. He won white Southern men. He won women. He won environmentalists. He won liberals. And that was a narrow election. 4 years later, he lost the evangelical vote, even though he was a Southern Baptist born again.
Right, yeah.
Evangelicals had turned against him. Yeah. Why? It's very interesting. They turned against him because Southern evangelical leaders like Jerry Falwell started giving speeches around the country saying that Jimmy Carter was not a real Southern Baptist. And why? Because Carter believed in the separation of church and state.
Mm-hmm.
And he refused to give, he was taking tax exempt status away from these white Southern academies that were popping up all over the South, that were really just an evasion of the efforts to integrate our public schools.
Mm-hmm.
So it was all about race, and it was about abortion, and these hot button cultural issues.
Yeah.
And the only group he continued to keep in the 1980 election were African Americans, because he had done a lot for this community.
Yeah. He
was good on racial issues. Well, if you're good on racial issues, that worries a lot of Americans. Yeah. This is just a fact. It goes back to the Civil War. It's why we fought a civil war. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of a lingering legacy in our society. And so Carter took on these tough issues, and he paid the consequences. And I would argue that, America rejected him despite his decency, despite his religiosity, despite the fact that he has certainly been the hardest working president we've had in the 20th century.
Absolutely.
This is a guy who got up at 5:30 in the morning, was in the Oval Office at 6:30, spent 12 hours, read 300 pages of memos every day. Right. Not many of our presidents, even the infamous former one, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. but not many of our presidents worked that hard.
Yeah.
And yet we Americans are impatient with we want easy answers. And Jimmy Carter, the nuclear engineer, as he described himself at times, was too smart to see, to accept easy answers. He found he found the complications in our society, and he tried to address them. And that proved to be a very unpopular thing.
Yeah. I have two final questions for you. So obviously people know about Carter, as we mentioned at the beginning, that he's obviously still alive. He'll be 98 in October. So, and he's still doing a lot of his work. And as I mentioned, he did lots of humanitarian work. He helped eradicate the guinea worm and reduce river blindness and many, many, many other issues. He's still very involved in many things, which is, tremendous. Won a Nobel Peace Prize in 2002, I think that's right, or 2002, whatever it was. But I guess the one question here is that what can we say, I guess, at the end, right? The legacy of Carter's, as you say, unfinished presidency, and broader his impact and influence around the world post-presidency.
Yeah, I like the subtitle of my book, The Unfinished Presidency, because it signals that the ex-presidency that we Americans all admire about Jimmy Carter is really simply an extension of his presidency. He is doing the same thing, that he's pursuing the same issues that he was when he was president. And it's, coming back to his sort of approach to politics and the influence of Reinhold Niebuhr's ideas on him. This is a guy who just really is focused on trying to solve problems and solve them in an intelligent way. He was, a difficult interview for me to do. Whenever I went to see him, he was still working in his office in the Carter Center, and he was tolerating the biographer in his office for an hour, but he really didn't care about that ancient history. He was focused on wiping out guinea worm disease and monitoring the civil war in Syria and planning his next trip abroad to monitor an election in Guinea-Bissau or Nepal. And that's what got him motivated. And he's very hardworking. Even in his 90s, he was very hardworking.
Yeah.
This is how he was in the White House, and this is how he has been to this day.
Yeah, it's absolutely incredible, his life. The last question I have for you is, what do you want people that pick up this book? Again, it's tremendously well written. It's well researched. It's really fabulous. But what do you want people that read it to walk away with? To say, yes, you got it. You got exactly what I was trying to say. Well, I think that's the hope of any writer, right? That people accurately get what you're trying to say. So, what is that one or two things that you want people to really kind of get from your book?
Well, I think presidential biographies are sometimes intimidating to people. They're often long and detailed. But this is a fabulous story. It's just a great American story about a guy who comes from this small town in South Georgia and with just his own smarts and determination wins the White House in a very improbable campaign, and surrounds himself with his friends from South Georgia, people like Hamilton Jordan, Jody Powell, and Charlie Curbo. And they're very colorful, funny people. They're smart. They're not Southern country bumpkins as they were portrayed in, the pages of the Washington Post. And so it's just, it's a fun story, and it's, I like to argue that biography is the best vehicle for learning history because it's very personal.
Yes.
It's storytelling. And through the life of this one man, you can learn a lot of history.
Yes.
And things that are going to be surprising. So
yeah,
it's fun, and he is an outlier. He's a very unusual man.
Yes, he is. Well, the book is called The Outlier, The Unfinished Presidency of Jimmy Carter. I'm assuming everyone can find this anywhere in bookstores. Where can people find you and your work, or what are the best places to find what you're up to?
Well, I'm at, you can go on the web and just punch in Leon Levy Center for Biography. And I have a great website there, and actually many events about other biographers. And you can find out about my activities there.
That's great. Well, look, Kai, I mean, this was so much fun. I really can't say enough thanks for you coming on and telling us about all of the work you've done on this biography, and just kind of your knowledge. And I greatly enjoyed the conversation. And so, just a
thank
big,
you for
big
having
thanks.
me. It was fun.
Of course. No, thank you. I appreciate it.